Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink, it is time for some Path of Exile discussion. Today I wanted to put together some discussion on good items to double corrupt in patch 3.22, assuming that you're playing in Trade League. Some of these ideas might still apply if you're playing in solo self-found, but there's going to be a few other considerations you'll need to make that won't be really covered in this video. The main thing in SSF though is make sure that you don't double corrupt anything unless you've already replaced it. So the first thing I need to cover here is how the double corruption chamber works. For some people this will be a recap, for other people it'll be new information. I also want to talk about the most important exceptions to these rules as well. So it's 25% for Alva's corruption chamber to do each of the following outcomes. Firstly, it removes 2 implicits at random, then adds 2 Vaal implicits. And these implicits are weighted the same as Vaal orbs are. The interesting thing though with the Vaal orb weightings is that they tend not to be very nasty, except on things that provide item quantity and a couple of other really rare things. For example, on chess pieces where some of the best corruption outcomes are, there is no difference in weighting between any of the different outcomes you can get. The second thing you can get is that all of the sockets on the item can be bleached to white. Now this no longer applies on Skin of the Loyal. This is a semi-recent change back in patch 3.16.0b for Bravo. It also has a 1 in 4 chance to utterly destroy the item in a cloud of smoke. This looks quite funny, especially when it happens to someone else. And the fourth outcome is that it bricks the item. This is a player term for turning it into a random rare item. Now this will change the item into a rare item with one of the various influence types. Shaper, Elder, or any of the 4 different Elder Slayers will have their influence on it. It may have some influence mods, it may not. And it will randomize the sockets, colors, and links. If the item class prohibits you getting an influence on it, for example if it's a jewel, this will just be a regular rare item instead without any influence on it. Broadly speaking, players call this bricking an item because it usually ruins it, although there's a couple of corner cases where this is actually the desired outcome. Most of the time though, the double corruption chamber is 1 in 4 to get the 2 implicits, and 3 in 4 to give you a disappointing result. Even though the socket bleach makes the item better, the inability to further craft it generally makes it worse than it was. Now note one thing that's very important. Corrupt items can't be further bench crafted, and this can be pretty ruinous. You want to make sure that if you're going to be taking something to the double corruption chamber, that it has any bench crafts on it that it might need in the future. If you don't put them on before you roll a dice on the double corruption, you can't add them later. You're also very limited in your ability to apply quality onto an item after it has already been corrupted. Now in some situations you have more flexibility here. For example, if you have a medium quality set of armor, you're probably not going to 30 quality it before you take it to the corruption chamber, but you can get it up to 29 with tainted armor as scraps. However, if it's a jewelry piece instead, then you have no ability to add quality after you've double corrupted the item. And so that means that if you're going to be double corrupting chasing one of those juicy attribute percent implicits on rings, then you definitely want to get attribute quality on before you take it to the corruption chamber. Otherwise, the item's never going to have it, and you'll be pretty disappointed if you roll 5% dex and 6% strength. You can fix up socket numbers, socket links, and also socket colors at a later stage, albeit using different mechanics to what you would have available before the item is corrupted. Now there are 3 exceptions that are important to these rules. The first one is that if you put in a normal rarity sacrificial garb and it rolls the double corruption option, this will instead be transformed into the unique chest Shadowstitch, which has 2 corruptions by default, and it also has its own special mods. Now this doesn't apply if the garb is magic or rare. If you're wondering what a sacrificial garb is, it's probably hidden by your loot filter and it only drops from Atsuri under normal gameplay, but Atsuri can drop a special chest piece that's actually pretty good. But part of the thing that makes it good now is that it has a very special implicit on it, which is removed when it becomes Shadowstitch. The second exception is the unique helmet Glimpse of Chaos. This does a lot of weird things, and we'll discuss these in a little bit more detail later. Generally though with this helm, your goal is to double corrupt it repeatedly until you get 2 implicits on it. Then after that you want to apply Vaal orbs to it. There are of course exceptions, it's going to depend on what the implicit that it rolls with is. The final exception that's important is Hands of the High Templar. Now this removes implicits in a different way. It will go plus 2 implicits up to a maximum of 5. On these gloves, however, Vaal orbs tend to be better. They tend to just be a better value option. The other thing we need to talk about quickly is the interaction with Hinekora's Lock, a very, very rare currency item that was added in patch 3.22 and that you can only get through the Trials of the Ancestors content. Now this item is very expensive. It's something in the 40 to 50 Divine Orb range at the time I'm recording this video. So if you're dealing with an item that's worth less than that, then Hinekora's Lock is not very important to you. But this interaction works in the most favourable way. Hinekora's Lock treats the corruption chamber as a currency item. This means that you can find out before you actually commit to using your corruption chamber on an item whether or not it would be destroyed or whether it would get a favourable outcome. Essentially, Hinekora's lock is able to sacrifice itself in order to protect your item, because if it does turn out that you get a detrimental result, you can just apply a nothing change to the item with something like a Blessed Orb, and once you've done that, the Hinekora's lock will be removed, but also the outcome will be re-rolled the next time that you apply a Hinekora's lock, and you take it to the Corruption Chamber again. So you should always apply a lock to the item before you take it to the Corruption Chamber if you're going to be double corrupting an item that is worth more than a lock is. For example, if you're double corrupting Original Sin, if you're double corrupting Headhunter, if you're double corrupting Mageblood, in any of these cases, definitely apply a lock beforehand. Additionally, sometimes you'll have a rare item that may or may not be worth more than a lock. You might not be able to sell it for a lock if you tried, but that would cost you more than a Hinekora's lock would to replace if it was lost. And in that situation, if you're going to replace the item anyway, then you should use a Hinekora's lock to save it as well. There's another two weird cases we need to discuss. These are unique items tied to Blight. So these are the ones that you often want to brick into a bad rare. What these uniques all share is that they can have Amulet style anoints on them which survive bricking. So the first one of these is Stranglegasp. This only drops from Blight Ravage maps, although there is a Divination card for it now. That Divination card is very, very rare. The only use of this amulet is actually to deliberately brick it. So this is the amulet that allows you to have 4 anoints on it. You can put 4 anointments on it that have very general use, and then once you've done that, you then attempt to brick it, either into an influenced rare using the Corruption Chamber, or alternately into a non-influenced rare with 6 mods using a Varlorb. If you do succeed in doing this, then you can further craft it either by using a Tainted Mythic Orb, or by spamming Tainted Exalted Orbs. Tainted Chaos Orbs are another option you could consider as well, but broadly speaking, Tainted Exalted Orbs are probably better. There's also the regular Blight uniques. So these are the ones that only drop from the Blight pump at the end of a Blight encounter. These are Breath Stealer, the Stampede, Replica Stampede, which is actually from Heist, Spore Guard, and 3 helmets that are all really bad if you use them as they're intended. With all of these items, these can have at least 1 and sometimes 2 anointments on them, or alternately they can have a Labyrinth or a Heist enchant, which is in the place of one of those anointments. Once you've got one of these and it's got the maximum allowed number of enchantments on it, then at that point you can try to brick it into a rare, and then if you succeed you can either Tainted Mythic Orb it, or alternately you can try and craft it further using Tainted Exalted Orbs or Tainted Chaos Orbs as you see fit. Now most of the time both categories of Blight items, both the Blight Ravage case of Stranglegasp and also the regular Blight Encounters ones, most of the time these would be hit with a Varlorb rather than a double Corruption Chamber, but you can definitely look into both options yourself because sometimes one of them will be better than the other. And of course, the first rule of Trade League needs to be restated here. We do not talk about Trade League. No, more seriously, don't use expensive resources like Corruption Chambers to make things if demand for that item is met by drops that other players get without trying to make those things deliberately. A good example of this is that players who are running Val Temple will get a considerable number of double corrupted common versions of uniques like Hyri's Truth. The only time you want to deliberately make these items is if your version is going to be meaningfully better than one that comes from RNG. Maybe you get one with top rolls, maybe you get one with catalyzed quality on it. In those situations, it can still be fine to double corrupt them, but if you're not doing special things that can't be done on one that dropped double corrupted, then you don't want to make common double corrupted uniques. They're going to drop by accident for some players. This first rule of Trade League is going to be the reason that I don't recommend making Shadowstitches in Trade League, although we'll come to the details of that in a sec. Alright, so let's quickly talk about the item that breaks all of the rules, and this is Glimpse of Chaos. This item only drops from the Trailmaster in the Tower of Ordeals, and it's a pretty common drop from him, but it's also something that there's not very many of because the mechanics of this item encourage people to destroy it a lot. So this item is weird. It always drops 1 implicit corrupted, and it can be modified while it's corrupted unless it loses the text that allows that to happen. Now the implicits on this item are from a very, very good list. This is different to normal helmet corruptions, and there are some amazing mods like 15% aura effect that you can roll on this particular item. So let's go through what Varlorbs do to this item first. Firstly, it can remove an explicit mod from the item at random. So this is kind of like the way that an Orbs of Annulment work if it's on a rare item, except here you're annulling a unique item instead. This can hit the can be modified while corrupted mod, and if you do hit that and remove it, then the item has been completely ruined. A Varlorb can also remove an implicit and add a special Glimpse of Chaos only implicit modifier. Again, this list is really, really good. A Varlorb can also change this item into another unique helmet, transferring over up to 2 implicits. So keep that in mind. Varlorbs can't get Glimpse of Chaos up to 2 implicits, but if it does have 2 implicits on it and you Varl it, then this can change into another unique helmet, which can be really, really good. It can also change it into a double influenced rare. If this happens, it will also transfer over up to 2 implicits. So keep in mind how good a 2 implicit corrupted Glimpse of Chaos is. Now, let's talk about how you would create one of these. What happens when you take Glimpse of Chaos to the Corruption Chamber? It has a 1 in 4 chance to remove 2 implicits from the item, or all implicits if there's less than 2, and then to add 2 of the special Glimpse of Chaos only implicits. This is the favourable outcome with the Double Corruption Chamber. Note that this is just the standard behaviour for the Double Corruption Chamber. All of the other Double Corruption Chamber outcomes are still there as well. You might bleach all of the sockets to be white, you might destroy the item entirely. All of those other options are available there. Once the item has 2 of these Glimpse of Chaos only implicits, these can then transfer onto other items, but to do this you need to hit it with Varlorbs, not with further uses of the Corruption Chamber. A really good outcome you could get would be to get a 15% aura effect Alpha's Howl. That's one thing that you can get if you get quite lucky with a Varlorb after you have double corrupted a Glimpse of Chaos, and that will also have another implicit on top of that as well. Another thing you can achieve by either the Corruption Chamber or by Varlorbs is to change the item into an influenced item. Now with a Varlorb here, it's going to change it into a double influenced item. With a Corruption Chamber, it's going to be single influenced. In either case, if you end up with an influenced rare Val mask here, and then it has a desirable implicit on it, you can Mythic Orb this for a modest chance to turn it into Fractal Thoughts. Fractal Thoughts is a tier 3 rarity unique, so it seems like it's probably about 1 in 20 that you'll succeed at this, but some of the implicits that you can get on Glimpse of Chaos are incredibly good on a Fractal Thoughts. So that's another use for it. This is firstly to double corrupt it in order to build it up to implicits, and then to Val it into a rare, and then to Mythic Orb it. Pretty rare outcome, but it is definitely something that can make the best Fractal Thoughts that exists in a given league. Or if you get a double influence Val mask, you can just craft it with tainted currency items. In short, 1 implicit Glimpses of Chaos are a very good item to double corrupt. Once they've got 2 implicits on them, no more bringing them to the Corruption Chamber, now you play around with Varlorbs instead. So the other 2 items that were in the exceptions category, Shadowstitch fails the first rule of Trade League. People make Shadowstitches by accident by opening up Voidborn Reliquary keys. It's a really rare outcome from the Voidborn Reliquary, but even then, the amount of Shadowstitches that enter the economy this way is more than enough to meet the demand that exists for this item. So, no point in creating Shadowstitches intentionally through the Double Corruption Chamber. You can find a better use for this. For Hands of the High Templar, Vals tend to be the better overall value proposition. You do end up with slightly better odds if you take things to the Double Corruption Chamber instead, but Hands of the High Templar are way cheaper to purchase from other players than Corruption Chambers are, and for that reason, better just to buy more. The only exception is that if you've got a Hands of the High Templar that already has 3 Val implicits on it, and it's a pretty good one, then double corrupting that might be an okay use of a Corruption Chamber, because it is more likely to get to 5 than you would be if you were to apply Varlorbs and you make a promise to yourself you're not stopping at 4 no matter what the 4th outcome is. Of course, many players will stop at 4 in that situation if they do get a desirable 4th implicit, and in that case, it ends up not being worthwhile. So all in all, Hands of the High Templar are an edge case used for the Double Corruption Chamber. Shadowstitch doesn't really work there at all. Next thing we want to talk about is that item slots for Corruption aren't equal. The best general purpose Corruption implicits are in the chest slot, plus gem levels for caster scaling, in the glove slot, curse on hits, and some very rare ring implicits like bleed immunity. But then there are some niche Val implicits that are good as well. The shield slot has some amazing ones, physical damage taken as an element or physical damage taken as chaos, and also some builds really want +4 to the level of an aura, and in that situation, non-chest slots where +4 aura levels is possible can be very good as well. Another big niche that exists is jewelry for Crystallized Omniscience builds, and that's because Crystallized Omniscience builds get a tremendous amount out of the various Val corruptions that grant +4 to 6% to each of 2 different attributes. So you'll see that come up a little bit when we talk about items that you might want to consider corrupting, especially when we talk about rare items. Okay, so with all of that out of the way, let's talk about the unique items that I'm going to recommend double corrupting in patch 3.22. Firstly, Utula's Hunger with a high life roll. Now this is an item that does not exist double corrupted except when players take one to the double corruption chamber. There are none of these getting made by accident. And the item is quite good and it's best in slot on a number of gear sets, and the only real improvement that you get is something that is the same item but that just has better stats, and that's what the double corruption chamber can do. Lightning Coil is next. Now this is a tier 3 rarity unique. This means that you might think it's not going to pass the first rule of Trade League, and that's because there are a fair number of this that drop out of places like Vaal Temple, And so there's a fair few in circulation that weren't deliberately created by players. The thing is that Lightning Coil is one of the most popular armor pieces to use this league, and there's not enough copies of it with good implicits on it to meet the league-wide demand for players who are looking for an upgrade on their character. For that reason, this ends up being one of the few tier 3 rarity uniques that I do recommend that you take to the Double Corruption Chamber. You could also take Heatshiver or Kaom Spirit, also in tier 3 rarity uniques that are popular to use, but Heatshiver has slightly weaker corruption implicits available than Lightning Coil has, and Kaom Spirit seems to be getting double corrupted a lot. So currently in Trade League, there's just a really high supply of well double corrupted Kaom Spirits. Definitely keep your eye on these items. If this video has some sort of impact on Trade League and people start doing Lightning Coil more, then it might be the case that one of these other equally rare and equally good uniques that fit on different builds ends up replacing it. One thing that's important to note about Kaom Spirit is that while it is the most commonly used tier 3 rarity unique in the game, it actually does not play well with Vol's Vision when it's corrupted. Vol's Vision is sometimes used alongside Kaom Spirit, not always, but quite frequently, and Vol's Vision absolutely requires that you are wearing no corrupted items in order to give you its main benefit. So for that reason, there are players who do prefer a Kaom Spirit that is still clean, i.e. has not been corrupted. Do keep that in mind. These are a minority of Kaom Spirit users. There are plenty of people who do want your double corrupted one, especially if it's got a good curse on here, or if it's got something else powerful like increased base attack critical strike chance, but there are people who also want the clean ones as well. Crystallized Omniscience is another item you might want to consider double corrupting. This is slightly more expensive, and this is why I recommend that you double corrupt this rather than viling it. Crystallized Omniscience really has two categories of outcomes that are extraordinarily good. One of them is to get increased aura effect on it. The other one is to get increased attributes on it. You could also get an additional curse as well, which is another really good thing. So ultimately, there's just a lot of good things in the pool for amulets, and Crystallized Omnisciences that are better than the baseline item tend to be in really high demand amongst players who are already quite wealthy in the league. In Trade League, there's a number of players for whom their Mage Blood is only the third most expensive item they have equipped. Those players are going to want your better than usual Crystallized Omniscience, and they've got a lot of wealth to throw around in order to acquire it. Now, Dialla's Malefaction is another item you can consider here. This is good on extreme glass cannon builds, where you go all in on offense, and we'll also have a look at a rare item alternative to Dialla's Malefaction later. Still in the uniques, we have Shavronne's Wrappings, an oldie but a goodie. This item has definitely fallen off in use lately, but it is still very popular. Now in the softcore Trade League world, Shavronne's Wrappings is sort of in a weird spot where it's a defensive armor that is also simultaneously quite an offensive armor. Shavronne's Wrappings allows you to quite safely use Pain Attunement, as long as you're able to meet all of the other setup requirements for Shavwraps, i.e. you have a large energy shield pool. Once you meet this condition, it lets you safely use Pain Attunement, and Pain Attunement is a 30% more multiplier to your damage, but Shavwraps provides no other damage on it. Contrast this to a popular alternative like Skin of the Lords, which provides +2 to the level of both socketed skill gems and socketed support gems, which tends to be +4 to overall gem level because you're probably using Empower level 4 in Skin of the Lords, maybe even Awakened Empower level 5 if you can splash out for something that expensive. What's really good with Shavwraps though, is that in the Ancestor League, it's easier than it's ever been before to scale up your gem levels really high. Most skill gems stop scaling super efficiently at gem level 30, and they start scaling only half as well beyond that. For example, many skill gems provide +8 to 14% more multiplier to damage for each skill gem level up to level 30, but beyond 30 they only provide 4 or 5% instead. Essentially, gem levels past 30 are only half as good as gem levels from 20 to 30. With Shavwraps, the extra damage you're getting in your chest slot is indirectly added through the use of Pain Attunement, which you otherwise might not be able to use on your character. And this is why it's so good. This then scales multiplicatively with the roughly level 30 gems that you're likely to have if you're wearing Shavwraps that are corrupted to have at least 1 +2 gem levels corruption on them. In that situation, Shavwraps can be an extraordinarily good piece of both hybrid offensive and defensive gear at the same time. We have Dawnbreaker, the shield that drops from the Searing Exarch. If this has a 20% physical damage taken as fire roll, double corrupting this has the potential to grant you more of this stat, and this can be extremely powerful if you stack it. This is one of the biggest sources in the game of this stat, especially if you're able to get more of it from Vile Implicits. Although hitting 2 of these physical damage taken as X mods is a real miracle roll, it is still possible. There are a couple of them listed for trade in this league's economy. One of them's listed for a mirror, the other one's listed for about 80% of a mirror, and I do think that both of them have a realistic chance of selling. That's how strong these items can be. Additionally, There are other favourable things you can hit with Dawnbreaker. You can get +4 to the level of Socketed Aura Gems as a double corrupt, which is another thing that will definitely sell as well. And you can also just get one good mod without a second mod that pairs with it. And there's a number of things that will sell if you get one of them. The key thing though is that you really do need to have a 20% or at the very least a 19% physical damage taken as fire roll in order for this to pay off. If you've got one that's only 14% in this stat, even if you do hit one of the premium Vile Implicits, you just end up with something that's only as good as an uncorrupted Dawnbreaker. Nimis is another item to consider. The interesting thing with Nimis is that it's being used on a lot of different builds. Here, your best outcomes are going to be aura effect mods, or they're going to be attribute percentage mods. There's not very many people that use Crystallized Omniscience and Nimis together, but for the people that do, the only thing better than a baseline Nimis is one that has 6% strength and 7% dexterity on it, and that's going to be fantastic. I do recommend that you attribute quality your Nimis before you put it in the Corruption Chamber. Remember that once it's been in the Corruption Chamber, it can't get any quality later. Next, we have Legacy of Fury. This item is in widespread use, it's best in slot for a popular build, and the Leviathan card is so rare that even though there are some being added into the League economy through the Leviathan card, which awards a double corrupted Maven item, this trickle of them is so small that it doesn't meet the demand that exists, and there's plenty of people who are looking to get a well-rolled Legacy of Fury that has 1 or 2 good Vile Implicits for their build. The Fourth Vow is another option. This is way more popular than last league. This is a very strong defensive armor and it's pulled a number of people away from Shavronne's Wrappings. So people who might have run Shavronne's Wrappings in the past are now using the Fourth Vow. But because both of these uniques are pretty rare, you'll find that there's demand for double corruptions of both of them that is not met by the RNG drops from places like Vale Temple. And the final suggestion is a unique item that your character uses that's a bit off meta, that's unable to be surpassed by a rare item on your build, and that you've already got a spare copy of. For example, my character in Ancestor Softcore is running the Formless Flame. This helmet is best in slot on my build. There's just no replacement for it. This is an item that I would strongly consider double corrupting for myself, except for the fact that I already have one copy of it that has the perfect Vile Implicit for me. So you can give that some thought as well, especially if you're using a unique that you're never going to replace and that well-rolled versions of it are already pretty cheap. So what about rare items? So there's a few niches where double corrupting a rare can be a good idea. So I thought I should just start in editing with a quick comment on when you don't want to double corrupt a rare item. And that is when the implicits on that rare item are particularly good. This is definitely the case for items that have Searing Exarch and or Eater of Worlds influence mods on them. Those are always implicits. They're going to be stripped off if you succeed with a Vile double corruption. And additionally, you also don't want to be double corrupting rare items that have really special synthesis implicits. But let's get back to the times that it is a good idea to double corrupt a rare. The main one is on ROG-sourced rings that are on bad bases, but that have mods that would, in theory, make them excellent on Crystallized Omniscience builds. So an example here would be a ring that has 55 strength, 52 dexterity, and 53 intelligence. This would be an absolute monster if it were to double corrupt, and it would hit 4 to 6% int, 4 to 6% dex on it. That would be something you would have already wanted to attribute quality as well, and then that would be a true monster of a ring if you were to hit that. So here your goal is to attribute quality the item, then you want to benchcraft the Elreon mod, that is non-channeling skills cost less mana. Then once you've done that, you want to double corrupt these and shoot for percentage to each of 2 different attributes corruptions. Now the 3 of these double attribute corruptions are mutually exclusive. If you get the dex strength version, you can't also get the strength int version, unfortunately. That would be magnificent if you could, but even getting one of them is still phenomenally good. Additionally, your second corruption can be really good as well. You could get something like Wrath has X% increased effect, which is fantastic. There's one of those for almost every aura. And you could also get as a second corruption, you are immune to bleed, you are immune to poison, or you are immune to ignite. All of which are really, really good. But even if you just get something small, even that will make the item better than it would be without it if the only Vile implicit corruption on it was the percentage attribute one. Here you want to search and trade for strength plus dex plus int on the item is greater than 100, and that'll help you find candidate items. Be a bit picky on these and be prepared to RNG annul them so that you can fit in the Elreon craft. You do want more mods, you don't just want to have the strength, dex and int exceeding 100. You can also make these items starting with essences and fractured starting points. So these fractured essence items are not things that have been intentionally created through the use of fracturing orbs. This is when you get 2 procs happening at the same time. if you spec into Essence on the Atlas passive tree, a couple of the travel nodes that you're going to be forced to take will have a percentage chance for monsters that are imprisoned in Essence monoliths to drop an additional item that has an Essence modifier on it when they're slain. If this procs, and the monster also gets the rare monster conversion proc that causes all of its loot to drop fractured, then the item that drops with the Essence mod will be fractured, and not only will it be fractured, but the locked mod will be the one that is the Essence modifier. That'll always happen when these two procs go off at the same time. So because of this, a number of the deafening Essence only mods are available fractured on bad bases like Moonstone Rings for less than you might otherwise expect, and that means that you can pick those up and then further craft them using various Essence methods, or even using different methods like fundamental fossils. Although I think for most people, the best results will come from the use of attribute essences rather than fundamental fossils. I think fundamental fossils are just in a pretty bad spot at the moment, and attribute essences are just stronger. So that's the way that these items can get created if you want to go for higher end ones that have better mods on them than you would get just by RNG drops from other players. Note that you don't want to do this with high stat amulets. So builds that want a high stat amulet probably want to use Crystallized Omniscience in this slot, and unfortunately you can't use the two together. And the rest of the stat stacking builds generally want the Talisman Attributes mod rather than any of the Vile Implicits, because a Talisman Attribute mod is incredibly good. Another option that you might consider is Tailwind-Elusive Boots. This is pretty fringe though, these are not cheap to make in bulk and the payoff may not quite be there, but at least it's something you might want to consider. And potentially more extreme again, you can do a build your own Dialla's Malefaction. There are influence types that allow you to roll +1 to the level of socketed skill gems, there are influence types that allow you to roll +1 to the level of socketed support gems, and with a faceted fossil, you can also roll +1 to an attribute type of skill gems. So for instance, +1 to all strength gems that are socketed in the item. If you get the right combination of these mods together, and then you get the right double corruption on it, you'll have an absolute monster of an item, but this is not going to be cheap to do. I would consider this to be a whole of league resource sink type crafting project, or even a complete vanity crafting project, rather than something that's a realistic profitable craft to do in the trade league. Now, most rare shields have no relevant implicits on them. A good but readily replaced shield is something that can definitely be worth a double corruption as well. And finally, physical weapons can double corrupt really, really well if you have a weapon that's good but not quite sellable. Some Vile Implicits are absolutely amazing on weapons, and this is something to keep in mind, especially if you've got a lot of tier 2 mods on your item. Then in that situation, if your double corrupt hits hard, you might decide you want to take things a little bit further and try for an RNG Tainted Divine Teardrop, which I had a video on last league that I'll put a link to down in the bottom left corner of the screen during the last 20 seconds of this video. And now the final thing you might want to consider is going to seem like a really, really weird choice. Those of you who know of the origin of the Crangled meme in the Path of Exile community might have heard someone ask, who the heck crangles a magic item? Well, in this league there is actually a reason you might want to do this. A helmet with the Ovyanus suffix perfectly rolled, like Kraken Peak, which you'll see in the bottom right of the screen now, this can be annulled down and then B-split to get a magic item that has the Ovyanus suffix. This is 60% to the rarity of items that are dropped by slain, rare and unique enemies. Now really you have two options once you've got your Ovyanus magic helmet. The first one, and the better one, and the more expensive one, is that you can apply the Harvest Craft that synthesizes an item, and you can hope to get an extra rarity implicit that way. That is the best possible outcome that you can get. That will have the best synergy with the aesthetic, and that'll be the best overall package. However, far, far, far cheaper than that, you can take the item into the 2 implicit corruption chamber, and you can try your luck with Alva. You've got more chances of building a bit of extra character power into your helmet this way. Magic Find characters tend to sacrifice a lot of character power in order to get all the Magic Find that they can. They tend to be a pretty weak character. This can help offset that slightly. Additionally, these sorts of builds will often use a lot of other really weird gear as well. They'll tend to use one of a synthesized wand with no mods on it at all, which maximizes the Magic Find boost of the aesthetic. Or alternately, they will use a bow of some description, and they will use a double corrupted quiver as their alternative, as their scoured item. In any case, there's a lot of things that you can look into if you're interested in playing a build that uses the aesthetic. Lastly, the aesthetic itself is actually something you could conceivably double corrupt, chasing the rarity implicit that's available on amulets. The rarity implicit that's default to a gold amulet is 12 to 20%. the rarity implicit that you can get from Vile Corruptions is 20 to 30%. So that's just going to be better, and the second corruption that you get on top is going to be a bonus. But for an ascetic to improve, it needs to be well rolled, and well rolled ascetics aren't cheap, so taking them into the corruption chamber is a fair risk as well. Lots to think about there if you're into magic finding, and I just thought it's interesting to have an answer to that Crangled meme. Who the heck Crangles a magic item? Well, someone that wants to use it in conjunction with the ascetic, might even double Crangle it. Anyways, that's all I've got on this topic for today. If you're watching this video when it's fairly new, I'm going to be running a private league starting next weekend, so I'll put some information up on that over the next few days. If you're interested in that and you're not subscribed to the channel, then subscribing will help you find out more about that info when it comes up. Otherwise, I'm going to leave it there. May your Varlorbs and especially your Corruption Chambers have interesting results, ones that you foresee with a Hinekora's lock where doing so is appropriate.